The Texas wind of 1851 was a thief, carrying the heavy scent of ripening cotton and the sharp metallic tang of institutionalized cruelty across the sprawling Edwards plantation. Under a sun that seemed to punish the earth for existing, a woman named Odessa moved through the endless white rows with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. To any casual observer, the overseer on his mount, or the master's guests on the veranda, she was merely an asset, a 23-year-old entry in a leather-bound ledger that valued her by the pound rather than the person. Her fingers, calloused by a decade of forced labor, possessed a hidden dexterity, a grace that went unnoticed by those who believed her incapable of complex thought. They watched her gather weeds by the creek at dusk and dismissed it as the simple-minded superstition of a Negro girl. They saw her weaving small, nondescript pouches from scrap fabric and laughed at her magic tricks. The overseer's wife had once made a spectacle of it during a tea party, her voice dripping with the expensive silk of her status as she mocked Odessa's weeds and wishes. But as that laughter echoed across the shaded porch, Odessa, standing in the doorway with a tray of crystal glasses, absorbed the sound like the very cotton she picked absorbed blood, silently, completely, and with a stain that would never truly wash out. Behind her carefully crafted mask of neutrality, a cold, ancient intelligence was beginning to crystallize into a singular, lethal purpose. In the mid-19th century, Texas was not just a state. It was a brutal frontier where the machinery of slavery collided with the lawless violence of Western expansion. Just 6 years after its admission to the Union, the territory had become a hunting ground, fueled by the recently passed Fugitive Slave Act, which turned every road into a gauntlet and every stranger into a potential kidnapper. The Edwards plantation was the crown jewel of this misery, spanning 3,000 acres of rich river-bottom land. Thomas Edwards, a man who viewed himself as a pioneer of modern plantation management, ran his estate with the cold efficiency of a factory. Here, the whippings were scheduled, the rations were measured to the ounce, and the security was outsourced to a specialized network of violence. 10 men, led by the veteran tracker Jake Morrison, formed a perimeter of fear around the property. These were not mere guards. They were professional hunters of human beings, men who understood the geography of desperation better than the people trying to navigate it. They knew the hiding spots in the brush, the sympathetic voices in the nearby towns, and the exact speed at which a starving man could run before his lungs gave out. To the world, they were the enforcers of order. But to Odessa, they were the first variables in a mathematical equation of vengeance that she had been solving in her mind for 2 long years. Knowledge was the only currency available to those whom the law had declared bankrupt, and Odessa was a master of accumulation. She had spent her nights and her few hours of freedom studying the patterns of the 10 men who kept the plantation in a state of siege. She knew that the Schneider brothers, Karl and Wilhelm, were immigrants who saw human trafficking as their shortcut to the American dream, preferring the eastern woods where the shadows masked their ambushes. She knew that young Silas Green, only 19 and already hollow-eyed, drank to silence a conscience he couldn't quite kill, while Marcus Whitley, a freedman who had betrayed his own for profit, relied on a cold, clinical knowledge of escape routes to trap the unwary. Odessa watched their rotations, their eating habits, and the way they treated their equipment with the same clinical focus she applied to the growth cycles of the toxic flora that thrived in the plantation's neglected corners. She understood that while their guns and dogs were formidable, their greatest vulnerability was their own arrogance. They didn't see her because they didn't believe there was anything to see. To them, she was part of the landscape, as static and unthinking as the soil beneath their boots. They kicked aside her cloth bundles with mud-caked heels, never realizing they were walking over the blueprints of their own demise, mapped out by a woman they considered a child playing with dolls. The art of the poisoner is the dark twin of the healer's craft, and Odessa was the heir to a lineage of knowledge that stretched back across the Atlantic to the ancestral soil of African herbalists. From her grandmother she had learned the law of the leaf, which plants brought a cooling sleep and which brought the fire of the grave. The Texas landscape was a pharmacy of death for those who knew how to read it. Along the creek, white oleander waved its beautiful deceptive flowers, hiding a toxin capable of stopping a heart mid-beat. In the marshy lowlands grew water hemlock, its roots containing a poison so concentrated that a fragment the size of a walnut could fell a grown man. Around the quarters, Jimson weed sprouted in the disturbed earth, its seeds packed with alkaloids that induced delirium, seizures, and eventual respiratory failure. Even the castor beans grown for industrial oil contained ricin, a substance of such lethal efficiency it would remain infamous for centuries. For months, Odessa had been harvesting these weeds, drying them in the rafters of the smokehouse and grinding them into fine, flavorless powders using a stone buried beneath her cabin floor. The cloth pouches that drew such mockery were not charms. They were chemical delivery systems, prepared with the patience of a strategist who understood that in asymmetric warfare, one does not charge the front gate, one quietly contaminates the well. The spark that finally turned Odessa's preparation into a wildfire occurred on a humid night in late spring, following the capture of a young man named Cato. He had been a dreamer, a boy who believed the stars would lead him to Mexico, but the hunters had found him 3 miles from the river. They brought him back, not just caught, but broken, a living warning to the 147 others on the ledger. That night, as the slave catchers celebrated their bounty with corn whiskey and raucous laughter in the overseer's quarters, Cato's screams drifted across the dark fields like the cry of a wounded animal that the world had forgotten to help. Odessa sat on the edge of her pallet, listening to the sound of a human spirit being systematically dismantled. In that darkness, something within her finally fused together, a cold, unyielding resolve that replaced fear with a calculated terminal mission. She would not merely run. She would dismantle the machinery of their terror piece by piece. She would turn their habits, their vices, and their very assumptions of superiority into the instruments of their execution. As the first light of dawn touched the Edwards house, the era of endurance ended and the campaign of the ghost began. The mathematics of vengeance were set. 10 men were marked, and Odessa was the only one who knew that the hunting season had officially changed. The execution of the plan began with Jake Morrison, a man whose life was a series of rigid, unbending lines. He was the primary architect of the plantation's fear, a veteran tracker who believed his mastery of the Texas landscape was absolute. Every Monday and Thursday, as the first grey light bled into the horizon, Morrison patrolled the north fence line, a stretch of perimeter that bordered the untamed brush where desperate souls often sought refuge. His routine was his armor, but to Odessa, it was a roadmap to his grave. She had spent months observing his stop at the winding creek, watching the way he would dismount with a groan of aging joints to water his mare and refill his own tin canteen. He was a man of specific, predictable appetites, particularly his reliance on a worn leather pouch of chewing tobacco that never left his vest pocket. Odessa understood that a sudden, violent death would spark an immediate inquiry, so she opted for the slow erosion of his physical system. She began by treating the sandy soil near his favorite watering hole with trace amounts of pulverized water hemlock root. This was not a strike intended to kill instantly, but to initiate a systemic decline. She watched from the edges of the cotton rows as he unknowingly ingested the microscopic harbingers of his own end, his arrogance blinding him to the fact that the very earth he patrolled was now working to reject him. Water hemlock, or cicuta, contains the potent unsaturated alcohol known as cicutoxin. Its molecular structure, which can be represented as C22, O22, acts directly on the central nervous system, causing a cascade of neurotoxic effects that mimic the symptoms of exhaustion or sunstroke. For 2 days, Morrison complained of heavy limbs and a nagging pressure behind his eyes, attributing the malaise to the oppressive July heat. Odessa, maintaining her mask of quiet servitude, saw the tremors in his hands as he reached for his tobacco. On the 3rd night, she took the ultimate risk. Slipping through the pre-dawn shadows with the silence of a hunting owl, she reached the tracker's temporary camp near the boundary line. With fingers made precise by years of intricate weaving, she coated the inner lining of his tobacco pouch with a concentrated paste of castor bean mash and dried hemlock dust. The mixture was designed to be lipophilic, adhering to the tobacco leaves and the moisture of his fingertips. When he next placed a quid in his cheek, the toxins would bypass the digestive system, entering the bloodstream directly through the mucosal membranes of the mouth. It was a masterpiece of chemical delivery, a fatal dose disguised as a lifelong habit, administered by the very hands he believed were only fit for the heavy labor of the harvest. While Morrison's system began to falter, Odessa turned her sights toward the eastern woods, the domain of Karl and Wilhelm Schneider. These brothers were the embodiment of frontier opportunism, men who had traded their Bavarian heritage for the dark currency of slave-catching. They operated with a clinical, almost mechanical unity, sharing everything from their rations to a dented Mexican war surplus canteen. This bond, meant to ensure their survival in the harsh brush, became the very vector Odessa would exploit. To reach them, she first had to master the iron teeth of the plantation's security. Under the secret tutelage of the plantation's blacksmith, who saw the fire in her eyes and asked no questions, she had learned the delicate art of manipulation. Using a bent horseshoe nail and a fragment of stiff wire, she practiced on the simple padlocks of the tool sheds until the click of a mechanism felt as natural as the snap of a cotton bowl. On a night thick with the hum of cicadas, she breached the Schneider's private gear shed. Inside, the air smelled of gun oil and stale sweat, a shrine to the violence they enacted daily. She found the tin canteen hanging from a peg, a communal vessel that would soon serve a different kind of communion. The contamination of the Schneider canteen required a different botanical profile. For this, Odessa utilized the white oleander, Nerium oleander, a plant whose beauty masked a lethal concentration of cardiac glycosides. These compounds, specifically oleandrin, interfere with the nervous ATPase pump in heart muscle cells, leading to erratic rhythms and eventual cardiac arrest. She mixed a tincture of the crushed flowers with a fine powder of Jimson weed seeds, creating a cocktail that would induce both physical collapse and mental disorientation. She didn't seek a rapid death. She needed a pattern of illness. If multiple men fell to varying degrees of the same symptoms, the plantation doctor, a man of limited imagination and even more limited medicine, would inevitably conclude that a localized outbreak of cholera or dysentery was to blame. She reintroduced the tainted water into the canteen, the poison clear and tasteless, as invisible as the woman who placed it there. As she relocked the shed and melted back into the darkness of the slave quarters, Odessa felt a strange, cold clarity. She was no longer a piece of property recorded in a ledger. She was the lead architect of a biological insurrection, rewriting the laws of the plantation with the ink of the forest. The heat of July intensified, turning the Edwards plantation into a shimmering crucible of dust and tension. The creek ran low, exposing the gnarled, toxic roots of the hemlock that Odessa continued to harvest under the cover of the protection bundles she left along the paths. These bundles were now part of the plantation's folklore, a source of constant derision among the white inhabitants, who saw them as proof of Odessa's primitive mind. This mockery was her greatest shield. The more they laughed at her magic, the less they looked at her hands. Meanwhile, Cato remained in the barn, a broken testament to the hunter's efficiency, his presence a constant low-frequency hum of trauma that fueled Odessa's resolve. She moved through the fields with her cotton sack, her back aching and her skin scorched, but her mind was a cool, dark room where she checked off the variables of her plan. She watched Jake Morrison stumble during the morning muster, his face a sickly grey that he tried to hide behind a mask of irritation. She saw the Schneider brothers passing their canteen back and forth in the eastern woods, drinking deeply of the malady she had prepared for them. The first threads of the web were tightening, and the hunters, so used to the role of the predator, were finally beginning to realize that the landscape they thought they owned had started to bite back. The transition from superstition to tragedy occurred with a suddenness that paralyzed the Edwards plantation. On the morning of July 10th, the routine of the north fence line was shattered when Jake Morrison's mare returned to the stables alone, her reins trailing in the dust. They found the veteran tracker near his usual watering spot, his body arched in the final agonizing contractions of a grand mal seizure. To the plantation doctor, the symptoms were a confusing mosaic of neurological distress and gastrointestinal failure. The man's face was a mask of cyanotic blue, his fingers still stained with the dark residue of the tobacco that had delivered his end. Because Morrison was 43, an age considered advanced for the grueling life of a frontier hunter, and because the heat was a physical enemy that summer, the official verdict was acute sunstroke complicated by tainted water. Odessa stood among the other field hands as the news broke, her head bowed in the practiced silhouette of grief, while beneath her headscarf, her mind was already striking a line through the first name on her list. The predator had been harvested, and the modern security of Thomas Edwards had suffered its first silent breach. The mathematics of mortality were beginning to balance the ledger of blood. By noon the following day, the outbreak claimed its next victims. Karl and Wilhelm Schneider were found in their shared tent, trapped in a cycle of violent emesis and cardiac arrhythmia that no frontier medicine could touch. The oleandrin she had introduced into their canteen had done its work with devastating efficiency, disrupting the electrical rhythm of their hearts until their pulses became nothing more than the erratic fluttering of trapped birds. The plantation doctor, now joined by a colleague from the neighboring county, moved between the dying men with an air of mounting desperation. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones about miasma and swamp fever, their scientific understanding restricted by the very prejudices that blinded them to Odessa's agency. They recommended a quarantine, insisting that all water be boiled, a directive that ironically served Odessa's purpose by creating a climate of medical crisis that camouflaged her targeted assassinations. The Schneider brothers, who had come to Texas to build a future on the sale of human flesh, found their American dream ending in a shallow grave behind the gear shed. Their Germanic precision had been no match for the botanical chaos Odessa had harvested from the riverbanks. The focus of the campaign then shifted to the youngest and most vulnerable of the crew, Silas Green. At 19, Silas was a boy playing a man's game of violence, his nights plagued by the memory of Cato's screams. He had taken to seeking refuge in the bottom of a whiskey bottle, trying to drown a conscience that hadn't yet been completely cauterized by the trade. Odessa recognized his alcoholism not as a vice, but as a strategic opening. She prepared a special vintage for him, a bottle of cheap rotgut she had scavenged and refilled with a concentrated tincture of Jimson weed, Datura stramonium, and water hemlock. The alkaloids in the Jimson weed, primarily atropine and scopolamine, would induce a state of terrifying delirium before the respiratory paralysis set in. On a night when the air was so thick it felt like breathing through wool, Odessa moved toward the back entrance of the slave catcher's quarters. She placed the bottle just inside the door, positioned where the light of a guttering candle would catch the glass. It was an offering of oblivion to a man who was desperate to forget, delivered by the very person he spent his days hunting. The delivery was a dance with the gallows. Every snapped twig under her feet felt like a death sentence, yet Odessa moved with the fluid, silent grace of a ghost. She knew that Silas, in his current state of alcohol-fueled paranoia, would see the bottle as a godsend or a forgotten treasure left by one of his fallen comrades. There was a cruel irony in the chemistry of her choice. The atropine would dilate his pupils to the point of blindness, literally preventing him from seeing the world as he slipped out of it. As she retreated back into the safety of the quarters, she passed the cabin where Dilsey sat on the porch, her eyes like two dark coals in the moonlight. The kitchen matriarch said nothing, but the way she shifted her weight, a subtle, heavy acknowledgement of the changing atmosphere, told Odessa that the elders understood the shift in the wind. The silly girl with her weeds was gone. In her place was a silent reaper who had learned to weaponize the very landscape of her captivity. The plantation was no longer just a site of labor. It had become a laboratory of resistance where the laws of chemistry and psychology were being rewritten in the dark. As July 12th dawned, the Edwards plantation was a house of mirrors, where fear and celebration existed in a precarious, suffocating balance. 5 men were dead, and the remaining 5, the 3-man team of Fletcher, Price, and Sullivan, along with the freedman Marcus Whitley, were descending into a state of hypervigilance that bordered on madness. Master Edwards, driven by a toxic mix of pride and denial, refused to cancel his upcoming birthday celebration, insisting that the fever would not dictate the social calendar of a gentleman. This stubbornness was the final piece of Odessa's puzzle. The celebration would require an influx of provisions, including a specific barrel of whiskey intended as a reward for the security detail. Working under Dilsey's sharp-eyed direction in the main house kitchen, Odessa found herself perfectly positioned to infiltrate the cellar. The transition from the fields to the great house brought her closer to the heart of the system she intended to decapitate. She was now a shadow in the halls of power, her apron pockets heavy with the powders of the marsh, waiting for the moment when the plantation's elite would raise a toast to their own destruction. The Edwards Manor was a monument to a curated delusion, a white-pillared sanctuary built upon the marrow of those it enslaved. As the heat of July reached its oppressive zenith, the house was transformed into a hive of frantic activity in preparation for Master Edwards's birthday celebration. For Odessa, the transition from the grueling cotton rows to the stifling heat of the great house kitchen was a strategic promotion. She was no longer a distant figure in the fields, she was a shadow moving through the very arteries of the plantation's power. The kitchen was the domain of Dilsey, a woman whose skin was etched with the maps of 40 years of servitude and whose eyes held the weary wisdom of a survivor. Dilsey ran the kitchen with a sharp tongue and a heavy wooden spoon, ensuring the elaborate demands of the Edwards family were met with surgical precision. To the white inhabitants of the house, Odessa was merely an extra pair of hands, an invisible extension of the kitchen's machinery. They spoke of the fever that had claimed 5 of their hunters as if it were a wandering ghost, never imagining that the architect of that mortality was currently peeling potatoes at their feet. Odessa maintained her performance of simple-minded obedience, her movements quiet and her gaze perpetually fixed on the floorboards, while her mind mapped the vulnerabilities of the house's most secure spaces. The cellar was the plantation's treasury, a cool subterranean vault where the finest provisions and the most dangerous opportunities were kept under lock and key. The heavy brass key to the cellar door hung from a cord around Dilsey's neck, a symbol of her trusted status and the final barrier between Odessa and her remaining targets. On the afternoon of the 12th, the opportunity Odessa had been calculating for weeks presented itself in a moment of engineered chaos. A younger kitchen worker, trembling under the pressure of the upcoming feast, accidentally overturned a massive cauldron of simmering beef stock. As the scalding liquid surged across the floor and Dilsey's thunderous reprimands filled the steam-choked room, Odessa moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a night hunter. In the confusion of the cleanup, she positioned herself behind the matriarch, her fingers, dexterous from years of weaving, delicately unfastening the knot on the key cord. The key slipped into her apron pocket with a silence that felt like a scream in her own ears. She immediately volunteered for a water run to the well, an errand that provided the necessary minutes to slip toward the side of the house where the slanted cellar doors were partially concealed by a thicket of white oleander. Inside the damp, earthen-smelling dark of the cellar, Odessa found the barrel she sought, marked in chalk with the initials for the security detail's celebratory reward. This was the vector for the 3-man team of Fletcher, Price, and Sullivan, men who operated with a pack mentality and would drink from the same poisoned source. For this group, Odessa had prepared a concentration of ricin, the lethal lectin derived from the Ricinus communis plant. Ricin works by entering the cells of the body and preventing them from assembling the proteins they need. Without these proteins, the cells die, leading to systemic organ failure. She carefully pried the wooden bung from the barrel and introduced a viscous, clear tincture of the toxin, ensuring it would mix thoroughly with the amber whiskey. The dosage was calibrated with the cold precision of a chemist. It would not strike immediately, but would initiate a slow, irreversible decline that would manifest hours after the first toast was raised. As she replaced the bung and retreated from the cellar, relocking the door and returning the key to Dilsey's person during the final frantic push of dinner service, Odessa felt the weight of the upcoming mortality settling into her bones. The mathematics of vengeance were nearly complete. The trap was set, and the hunters were about to celebrate their own demise. The night of July 13th was an exercise in grotesque contrast. On the lawn, the elite of Texas society gathered in silks and linens, their laughter mingling with the strains of a fiddle, while the enslaved staff moved through the shadows like ghosts serving a feast they would never taste. After the formal dinner, Master Edwards called forward the remaining hunters to receive their bounty for maintaining order during the crisis. Fletcher, Price, and Sullivan stepped onto the veranda, their faces flushed with the arrogance of men who believed they had survived the fever. Odessa watched from the kitchen window as the overseer poured the poisoned whiskey into their tin cups. She saw the amber liquid catch the light of the lanterns, a lethal communion disguised as a reward. They raised their cups to the master's health, the irony of the gesture thick enough to choke the air, and drank deeply. Within their systems, the ricin began its silent, molecular sabotage, beginning a countdown that would end in a cluster of identical illnesses by dawn. The pack was broken, though they didn't yet know they were already ghosts walking. The final variable was Marcus Whitley. As a freedman who hunted his own for profit, he was a predator who understood the mask better than any white tracker. He lived in a solitary cabin on the edge of the woods, his suspicion a suit of armor he never removed. Odessa knew that Whitley would never drink from a communal barrel or accept an offering from the house. To reach him, she had to weaponize his own paranoia. She had observed that Whitley relied on a specific well near the stables, one he believed was cleaner than the river-fed sources used by the field hands. For weeks she had been burying bundles of water hemlock and oleander roots near the well's drainage pipe, allowing the toxins to leach slowly into the water. But for the final strike, she needed something more direct. She utilized the psychology of the protection bundles, placing one near his cabin door that appeared to have been dropped in haste. Inside the bundle was not just herbs, but a needle-sharp thorn from a honey locust tree coated in a concentrated paste of cicuta toxin. She knew Whitley would not laugh at the bundle like the others. He would investigate it, his calloused hands seeking to dismantle the magic he despised. In the act of clearing the superstition from his doorstep, he would find the very real, very physical sting of the frontier's revenge. The dawn of July 14th did not bring the usual harsh bray of the morning horn. It brought a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press down on the Edwards plantation like a physical weight. By the time the sun had cleared the jagged line of the eastern woods, the three-man pack of Fletcher, Price, and Sullivan had been reduced to 3 bodies in various stages of agonizing collapse. The ricin had performed its molecular purge with a cold, mathematical certainty, systematically deactivating the ribosomes within their cells, specifically targeting the 28th RNA dolar, effectively halting the production of the proteins required for life. The symptoms were a horrific tableau of internal failure, bloody emesis, necrotic organ tissue, and a neurological thirst that no amount of river water could slake. Marcus Whitley, the freedman who had betrayed his own for the master's coin, was found slumped on his doorstep, his hand still clutching the protection bundle he had sought to dismantle. The honey locust thorn, coated in a concentrated paste of cicuta toxin, had delivered a lethal dose directly into his bloodstream through a single, insignificant scratch. 10 men, the entire original security apparatus of the Edwards estate, had been eliminated in a span of 4 days. Thomas Edwards, once a man of clinical logic and modern efficiency, now paced his study in a state of fractured reality, surrounded by the ghosts of his own hubris. The fever had become a massacre, and for the first time in the history of the plantation, the hunters were extinct. The investigation was led by a magistrate from the county seat, a man whose eyes were as cold and sharp as the scalpels used by the plantation doctor. He arrived on a property that smelled of lie and visceral fear, where the white inhabitants looked at every shadow as if it were moving. The magistrate was not a man of medicine, but of patterns. He recognized that 10 men do not die of swamp fever in such a precise chronological sequence. He interrogated everyone, from the terrified overseer to the lowest field hand, but his focus eventually narrowed onto the superstitious girl who had been seen leaving bundles of weeds across the property for months. Odessa was summoned to the great house, the very room where she had once served tea while being mocked as a simple Negro girl by the plantation wives. She stood before the magistrate, her posture a masterpiece of defeated submission, her voice a fragile whisper of engineered confusion. She spoke of spirits and charms and the old ways her grandmother had taught her, leaning into every degrading stereotype the magistrate held about the intellectual capacity of her people. She showed him her remaining bundles, harmless arrangements of sage, wild onion, and scrap cloth, and wept with a convincing terror at the suggestion that her protection had somehow failed to save the men. This standoff was a psychological duel between 2 vastly different worlds. The magistrate possessed the law, the guns, and the education of the ruling class, but Odessa possessed the truth and the absolute invisibility granted to her by his own prejudice. He looked for a chemist, a sophisticated rebel leader, or a conspirator among the men. He found only a simple woman who believed in weeds and wishes. The doctor, unable to find any physical evidence of mineral poisons like arsenic or lead in the food supplies, was forced to concede that the cause remained an atypical contagion, or perhaps a localized strain of cholera. Without a weapon, a confession, or a single witness, the law of the white man reached the limits of its power. They could not conceive of a woman like Odessa conducting a campaign of asymmetric warfare using the molecular properties of the landscape they claimed to own. They dismissed her, the magistrate's frustration palpable as he waved her from the room with a sneer of contempt, convinced she was too ignorant to be a threat. As she walked back to the quarters, the air finally broke, and the rain that had been promising for days began to fall, washing the dust and the toxins of the Edwards plantation into the river. She had survived the scrutiny of the system she had just decapitated, her mask of servitude serving as an impenetrable armor. In the quiet aftermath of the purge, the power dynamic of the plantation shifted in ways that were felt rather than spoken. The new slave catchers who arrived to replace the fallen 10 were hesitant, their patrols confined to the main roads and their eyes constantly scanning the tree line for invisible threats. The legend of the ghost of Edwards began to circulate in the quarters, a whispered story of a woman who had turned the earth itself into a weapon of vengeance. Old Martha, the ancient matriarch who had seen the rise and fall of generations, shared a final moment with Odessa under the shade of the live oaks. She didn't ask for details, nor did she offer praise. She simply reached out and touched the calloused palm of Odessa's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the terrible burden of agency. "You walked the dark path, child," Martha whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry corn husks. "And the path has changed because you stepped on it." Odessa realized then that while the institution of slavery remained, the illusion of its invulnerability had been shattered on this small patch of Texas soil. She had proven that even in the heart of the darkness, a single mind, fueled by the memory of a broken boy named Cato, could dismantle the machinery of terror using nothing but patience and the plants of the field. The Edwards era would eventually crumble, eroded by debt, the lingering trauma of the massacre, and the approaching storm of the Civil War. But the story of Odessa, the woman who harvested death from the riverbank and delivered it in the guise of silence, would endure as a subterranean current of hope. She would eventually take her own chance at the horizon, vanishing into the Texas brush with a small group of survivors, heading toward a freedom she had already claimed in her own mind long before she ever crossed the Mexican border. She was no longer an entry in a ledger or a piece of property to be traded for profit. She was the architect of her own liberation. Her story remains a reminder that the art of resistance is often found in the very things the powerful choose not to see. As the wind continued to carry the scent of cotton across the Edwards land, it no longer carried only the smell of cruelty. It carried the memory of a woman who had looked at a merciless horizon and decided that the only way to endure the world was to change the mathematics of its mortality. The ghost of the plantation remained, a silent sentinel in the rows of white bowls, proving that even a person defined as a thing can possess the power to make the world tremble.